I'm Margaret Palmer. I'm Director of SESYNC, the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, and I'm really happy to see all of you that are here, as well as those who are joining us remotely. As you know, to accelerate research, NSF announced a new opportunity to support the development of international network-to-network collaborations. To enhance community preparedness for this, NSF has organized a number of activities, some of which have already occurred. They held a webinar to introduce the new opportunity, a workshop on stakeholder engagement, and they funded a workshop using the so-called toolbox to focus on team science. Today's workshop is focused broadly on what it takes to make a research network successful. And obviously a research network is a form of an organization. We have a number of accomplished speakers who will talk to us throughout the day and a half, and the topics will include things like examples and models of networks and how they came about, processes that can be used to identify the goals of a particular network and to reach agreement among the members of that network, the difficulties that are associated with dispersed collaborations, which many of you may be aware of already, but importantly, how to overcome these and what some of the strategies are, and especially the importance of communication. There'll also be a discussion of team science, the fundamentals of that, and why that's an important, the principles of that are important to consider when forming an organization like this. Discussions of setting expectations and evaluations will come up, and then important issues of data sharing and data management. I wanted to begin with just emphasizing that there is extensive research already showing that research excellence depends not only on having great researchers and all the skills you need for a particular problem, but on the conditions of the research environment, the structure of the organization, the kinds of processes that are employed, the team culture and engagement climate, and particularly the leadership, which is extremely important. Not necessarily to be a figurehead, but to be a very active participant that oversees a very transparent process and pays attention to team dynamics. What I thought I would do is to provide some examples of these attributes and some of the things, or these activities, and some of the things that I mentioned in my opening by telling you a little bit about SESYNC and how we formed. Now, the reason this is relevant is that SESYNC actually has many of the attributes in common with a network of networks. All of the work that SESYNC has supported is team-based, and much of the interaction among those teams is done remotely, not here necessarily at the center. Additionally, we're international in scope, and this is both in terms of the participants that are involved in our networks, and I would say we have about 40 different networks currently. We've had more than that historically. Highly international, and then the questions that they focus on are also very international in scope. Obviously, they're related to our particular center theme, which is environmental and social dynamics associated with that. And these are just a few examples of some of our networks that have focused on urban biodiversity, impacts of narco-trafficking on land use and land cover, and global wildlife trade and disease risks. The organizational theory that we used at SESYNC, and it's really important to think about this as you begin designing a network, is that first we worked together among the leadership team to co-develop what our vision was and what our goals were. And these were very explicit, clearly stated, and you'll see as I move on, were used to guide how we developed the way the center would run. The next step we took on, and this is just our particular organizational process, developmental process, was to identify what we thought the key challenges were associated with forming an effective center focused on, in our case, socio-environmental problems. And those went beyond just the process topics that I talked about a few minutes ago, and depending on what the network is that you're interested in forming, you will also have challenges that go beyond just the organizational ones. We then use those challenges that we identified to develop and design a number of processes and our organizational structure, including our staffing, that would help to overcome those specific challenges. And I'll emphasize a bit later that in particular, we used a highly adaptive developmental process with rapid evaluation, self-evaluation, and center evaluation, not external but internal, to change our processes until we had settled on one that we thought was very effective. And for this reason, we've often talked about the center as experiment is how we formed. The processes and structures that we developed included, as I mentioned, not only the types of positions and the programs, but also a set of processes which are summarized here. It's not important for you to read these specifics because this is specific to SESYNC, but a set of things we would do to help accelerate teamwork. Now remember, in our case, each of the teams we support is a form of a network, although it may be smaller than the networks that you're focused on. Ours range in size from 9 to maybe 25 or 30 individuals around the globe. The important thing is we thought deeply about how we could make those networks successful, and that involved active types of things with teams, and it involved things that we could do distantly. It even involved things that the teams weren't aware we were doing in the background. Some of the lessons we learned, first, that the leadership should be involved very actively in recruitment. That is, to the extent you can, instead of just opening the doors to everyone, really identify the kinds of people that are critical to your network. Also pay attention to the extent to which they have collaborative skills. They're collaborative ready. For most of you, if you've done collaborative work, you know that, one bad apple can really cause problems. And so you do want to focus on those sorts of things. It's really important to seek diversity across a lot of dimensions. There are a number of research studies that have shown diversity accelerates innovation, and that can be along a variety of dimensions, including not only ethnic diversity, but diversity in disciplines, diversity in methods and perspectives. It's also critical that in building the team originally, that the stakeholders involved, and I'll revisit this issue of stakeholders again, but they should have input in terms of the kinds of people or individuals you want to recruit to the network. Now, in terms of sustaining teams, which is particularly a problem when you are working remotely, it is essential to have at least one face-to-face meeting, hopefully early on if possible. Forming some sort of social bond, even if it is simply getting to know someone, who they are, where they're from, can make a huge difference. Social interactions are critical at that point in time, but they don't have to end when you're working remotely. There are ways to do things that, and again, this is where the leadership plays a critical role in ensuring this happens, that there's some levity in discussions, that there's a sense of connectivity that goes beyond just getting information and sharing data. Communication, you're going to hear about it all day long. The one thing I'll say about it, other than just it's important, is that we found that choosing the simplest communication platform was the best. I had this naive idea when we opened 8+ years ago that things had advanced so much. We were going to have the perfect remote connectivity and people would interact easily. No, people get dropped. People don't understand how to get on. The simpler you can make that, and being willing to change if the group really works better in another format. So we developed our own way to communicate electronically among teams. Turns out they didn't want to do that. Most teams wanted to use a Google platform. So you just have to be flexible and change and do what works. One thing that has come from research as well, and I learned this from reading Steve Fior's book, if any of you are familiar with him, is that recognizing each individual's contribution to the team is actually really important, and it's important to do that repeatedly. Now, by that, I don't mean saying, oh, thank you, Mary, your role as the data something is so important. What I mean is devising ways to ensure that all members of the team know who's doing what and why they're critical to the team. And this can be simply in the form of those different individuals reporting out repeatedly, or again, the leader trying to pull different people in to clarify that. Accountability is also important. So while each individual should have a role in the network, they also should be accountable for that. And so, for example, one of the ways we do that at SESYNC is we actually require meeting with the teams or the individual networks remotely, periodically, to ask them to update us on what's going on. And this actually keeps them on schedule. It's not that different from reminding your kids you have homework. But when they have to give some sort of a formal presentation or present to the group repeatedly about their progress on what they are responsible for, it actually makes a difference. It's important to have early on some rules that the group sets up. And the kinds of rules that you want to set up vary depending on your goals. In our case, one of the most common things is often becomes issues of authorship on publications. And so we really encourage our teams to make that decision early on, what constitutes authorship. It's much better to do that before you get to a point where there's something being written and there's a question about who is an author. But there are also other forms of things that should be talked about, rules of engagement, not putting other people down, et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of things should be talked about. There also should be an individual who is responsible for doing all these things above. I can't emphasize enough, somebody has to be responsible for that and has to make sure it always happens, or else it tends to get left by the wayside. I think many of you are aware that NSF has been focusing on encouraging convergence research. There are lots of different words you could use to describe what convergence means. We had been using the word actionable. It simply means that it is a problem that the team or a network is focused on that has societal relevance. And it typically is one that requires more than one discipline and a group working together on that topic, particularly with those who care about the outcome of the research. And by that I mean stakeholders is the common word. I often had trouble with that word because to me that meant perhaps, for example, the fishing industry, if you were focusing on a project related to fisheries. It could be that, but it also could be something broader because we tend to fund at SESYNC what we call actionable but fundamental. That means our projects that we fund, our networks, are focused on topics that could be relevant in another place or point in time. So often our stakeholders are much broader. They may be policymakers, they may be representatives from a non-governmental organization, since we don't push to make something happen that's related to a policy, but we try and accelerate research that could help inform decisions and inform policies. It's important for us to be involved with those who care about the outcome of the research. Often you hear a discussion of the importance of value propositions, and it's important to make those early on. And what that means is to really explicitly understand what it is your stakeholders, in whatever form they are, what kinds of benefits they expect that you hope you can deliver from that. Effectiveness of interdisciplinary collaborations is also something that SESYNC had to focus on. And so I'll just mention some of the lessons learned. What you see here in the last slide, I showed that about 25 members of each of our networks is what we call a stakeholder or a potential knowledge user. Sometimes we say that. This shows the academic composition of our networks. And you see, in our case, they're highly diverse. It depends on what your network is focused on. And so we think it's essential in many teams to start out with a focus on epistemological issues. That doesn't mean you walk in the room and say, okay, let's talk about epistemological issues. It means you design an activity that actually elicits some of that tacit knowledge people bring to the room, which can really influence, and their views and backgrounds, which can greatly influence what they say in their input. and if it is actually recognized openly, things can run more smoothly. An example of an activity that I've seen Jonathan Kramer, who's our lead facilitator here, do with a team is to have each member of, in your case it might be a network, at the very first meeting, either write down or draw an image of what they think would represent a conceptual model of the problem and the way it could be solved. Then the group, one by one, individuals share those conceptual models with the rest of the group. And what that does is it helps to bring out that tacit knowledge. So for example, I often talk about, let's say you have a network focused on water security, and you have diverse members of that network. Well, myself, as a biophysical scientist, I might immediately start focusing on soil quality, water availability, increased production. Well, a social scientist in that network may immediately start talking about vulnerability, access to food. That can fundamentally change the dialogue or the direction that that project may go once you recognize that there are many more dimensions of that which actually often focusing on both become far more interesting. Conflicts, not necessarily out-and-out fights, but conflicts are extremely common. They can be very productive in networks if they're managed well and they're not just avoided and pushed under the table. Here's where the leader can play an important role in looking for those and ensure that they're not just set aside, but that they're addressed. And again, they can be healthy and sometimes lead to more positive outcomes intellectually. Facilitators can be useful at different stages. It depends on the team if they're open to this and if it's something that they could benefit from. We use them at SESYNC fairly often. One of the mistakes we see most often that my colleague Jonathan has pointed out so frequently to me is teams have a tendency, if they're highly interdisciplinary, to quickly split up by discipline into subteams. Okay, well, we'll go off in this room and we're going to put this together because you need it and this and this and this. That's a big mistake. It's really important to stay together from the beginning. What tends to happen is you may get a lot of papers that are interesting but mostly disciplinary, but the really interesting work, which is at the intersection, rarely gets done when it's approached in that fashion. So you want to be careful about that. And I want to close with just talking briefly about training the next generation and what we do at SESYNC. So there's lots of different ways to have a big impact in terms of the next generation of scientists. In our case, we focus primarily on our postdoctoral program. However, I should say we have ramped up a major graduate program in the last 5 or 6 years. What's interesting about our postdoc program is that I would say it's two-pronged. So part of it is a focus on their science and their science project, and that's critical. That's what we're all here for, is to advance research. But a big part of it also that we've put in place here is what we call our immersion program. And the goal of that is to really build not just professional skills, but the kinds of skills that will enhance ability to engage in interdisciplinary work, and in our case, because our interdisciplinary work is around socio-environmental systems, we think it's essential for the postdocs to learn enough about the core disciplines that are typically brought in to solve socio-environmental problems, that they even know that they might want to collaborate with a person from that discipline. And often this means things like learning a little about how different disciplines, the theoretical lens through which they approach questions, the kinds of methods they use. So for example, we may have a postdoc who's a climate modeler, and they have no idea that ethnographic research can be highly quantitative in the way it can be used, what it actually means to do that. We had, in our first year of immersion, workshops, and the way we run these is we invite some of the top scholars in from the discipline we're going to focus on, and sometimes rather than a discipline, it's a topic. And we ask those scholars to talk about, again, the theoretical lens and the methods they use, not to talk about their own research other than to use it as examples. And they lead sort of interactive discussions with the postdocs. from that, I heard postdocs, many of them come out and say from one of the workshops, I didn't know I need to work with anthropologists. That's who I need to be working with. That's just the way we do it, highly interactive. We do other things. We call this program dispositional learning, and the idea is to learn by doing rather than just being lectured at. We have workshops where they actively practice team science skills. We also encourage them to participate. We have typically 20 postdocs in residence here, but we encourage them to participate in one of the networks that we fund that mostly works remotely. And then we involve them as a panelist for peer review and so forth. So the point is they're doing research, but they're also being trained up in a different way to try and undertake the kind of work you're trying to do at this point more effectively. So thank you very much. At this point, I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Dr. Carrie Ritz.
I just want to talk a little bit about the purpose and the goals of this particular workshop, kind of following on Margaret's introduction. So the overall goal of this workshop is to introduce self-identified potential network of network PIs and participants to the science of team science, particularly as relevant to remote communication and dispersed networks. Our speakers will cover a range of topics and examples, such as effective network communication, participant engagement, network leadership, and management techniques. These topics have been identified, as Margaret indicated, in a growing body of literature around the science of team science, organizational management, and effective transdisciplinary research collaborations as key themes, challenges, and opportunities that transcend disciplines. We hope that participants will leave with an enhanced understanding of the critical role played by different leadership styles, transferable techniques to develop organizational and communication strategies, methods to establish a shared vision and network of network goals, insights into data sharing agreements and management, and the vital role that multi-level flexibility and adaptation play as networks evolve and change through time. So that just kind of gives you an introduction of what we're hoping to achieve through our invited speakers. I think the last piece that I wanted to convey is that in terms of the agenda and flow, we'll have speakers talk followed by 15 to 20 minutes of in-person questions and then 15 to 20 minutes of remote questions. So if you're participating remotely, you can submit your questions on our YouTube chat at any time, and we will feed them up for that part of the session and try to get to as many as we can within the time constraints that we have at the end of all the talks, or at the end of that talk. Okay, those are sort of the logistics so that we can move forward. I thought this would be a good time for us to figure out who we are in the room. So we're going to kind of go around and do participant introductions. And I'd like each participant to take a few moments to give us your name, your title, your affiliation, and why you're interested in the workshop.
Hi, I'm Selena Keneally, and I work at New Mexico EPSCoR as the Education and Outreach Manager. I'm pleased to be here with you all today, and I'll pass this along.
Steve Uzo, New York Hall of Science. I'm the chief scientist.
Catherine Kramer, and I'm very happy to be here. I am the founder of a brand new entity, and so this is a great opportunity to learn from you all. It's called the Woods Hole Institute. Happy to tell you more about our mission. And I'm also on the board of the Network Science Society. I've been interested in studying networks, particularly growing network of people interested in network science education, and we have published a brochure on that, and happy to talk more about that as well in the future, and looking forward to it.
My name is Tim Spuck. I'm the Director of Education and Public Engagement for Associated Universities Incorporated. My interest in being here is to learn from all of you. Hearing the first presentation, my question was, where were you 3 years ago? Because I'm thinking about projects that I've been, currently PI on that are building networks or building communities. And so just trying to figure out how I can be more efficient and how I can share what I've learned, both the successes and the failures of my experiences.
Hi, I'm Claire Hemingway, and I'm the program director that's managing the new AccelNet program, and that's short for Accelerating Research Through International Network-to-Network Collaborations.
Steve Sawyer, sitting in the middle, so I'm spinning around. Syracuse University, I study work, and most of the past decade is studying the work of researchers, so thanks for helping.
Hi, I'm Lauren Buck. I'm at Northern Arizona University, professor of biological sciences. I also have an appointment at the University of Sao Paulo, so I spend a lot of time doing international work back and forth. I'm also PI on a research coordination network funded by the National Science Foundation.
Good morning. My name is Marissa Rinkus. I'm a research associate with the Center for Interdisciplinarity and the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which Margaret mentioned earlier, and so we do help facilitate those epistemological conversations that you would like to have, and we're working with NSF to provide the PI's workshops, the current AccelNet PI's workshops in the end of October, so I'm here to learn how we can better support researchers for networks to networks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ariane de Bremond. I'm the Executive Officer of the Global Land Program, which is one of the global research projects of the Future Earth Global Change Research Initiative. I'm also a senior scientist at the University of Bern at the Center for Development and Environment in Switzerland, where the International Program Office is based, but I am faculty at the University of Maryland College Park in Geographical Sciences. And I'm PI on a NASA-funded socio-environmental synthesis of large-scale land acquisitions. But I'm particularly interested in this program because as a network within a broader network that's looking to sort of stretch the network dimensions from the traditional sort of geosciences and within the sciences to much more sort of TD-based approaches, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and looking at how different kinds of actors can be incorporated into new network structures. And we have so much to learn on that and so much to do, and I wanted to come for all those reasons.
I'm Jay Jones. I'm an ecosystem ecologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm a PI on a research coordination network focused on stream ecosystems, and I'm interested in how we can connect to other networks and expand what we're doing.
Morning, everyone. Eduardo Santillan. I am based at the University of Kentucky, and I'm affiliated with a number of networks, including EPSCoR and LSAMP, and more recently, an NSF research traineeship program. And all of this includes a considerable amount of team science and also, well, networking and networking between networks, and thus here I am.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pamela Collins. I'm a scientist at Conservation International and their Moore Center for Science. In a past life, I very briefly studied startup culture and dynamics, and it's really cool to see a lot of the similarities between what you guys are all outlining here and that body of knowledge, so awesome. My portfolio at Conservation International focuses on the linkages between conservation and sustainable development within the SDG context. I have a particular focus on water-related issues, and my portfolio is already highly networked. A lot of our collaborations are international across sectors, across every boundary you can think of, we break it. So that's an awesome thing about being at an NGO. My goals for being here are to continue to build on my knowledge in every dimension you can imagine, to build my own network by getting to know all of you, and then also to learn a little bit more about the AccelNet opportunity, because I hear that's relatively new. I'd love to get a better sense for what that entails. So.
Hello, my name's Stuart Davies. I'm at the Smithsonian Institution, and I run a global network on forest ecology, tropical and temperate. We're in 27 countries now. And I'm very interested in learning and developing how we can network among other groups who are doing forest science at a global scale. So.
Hello everyone, my name is Wilfrido Moreno. I'm a professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering at the University of South Florida, Tampa, Florida. And presently I serve as the Director of Research and Development for a consortium, it's called VTech, the Ibero-American Science and Technology Consortium, that we have more than 100 universities in Latin America, Spain, and Portugal. And our main focus has been improving engineering education. And in the last 5 years, we've been creating networks in the area of research and collaboration among the faculty members within these universities.
Thank you. My name is Igor Alvarado. I'm from National Instruments, so I come from industry. I have also worked with Willie on the VTech initiative in Latin America, but we also participate directly on several consortia. One of them, for example, is the NSF Power Consortia for wireless communications and 5G. So my role in the company and National Instruments is to develop collaborations with universities. I actually the academic research manager, which is a very unique position on the industry side. So I try just to help to connect, universities, researchers, and industry to solve some of the big challenges that we have in technology and related topics.
I'm Linda Kinkle. I'm at the University of Minnesota. I'm leading the NSF-funded Agricultural Microbiomes, RCN, and what's struck us, what's really blindsided me, is the extent to which activities in this area internationally are enormous. We've been approached by, I'm on the European Microbiome Initiative now, the Australian, the Southeast Asian, the South American, and the reality is this can't all interface through one or two people. We need to much more effectively find a way to work together, and I hope to learn those things here. I have to also say one thing I've been trying to really work deliberately with. I've got a set of 4 postdocs in our lab, and as I just reviewed tenure packages this fall, some of you might note, when I started, you went up for tenure with papers with 1, 2, maybe 3 authors. And every tenure package that I've seen, those students or those faculty are coming forward with papers with 6, 8, 11, 14 authors. You collaborate to be productive today. It's a different world. And I look at these 4 young postdocs and I'm asking myself, how can I help them learn how to be a strategic and effective collaborator? And I'm already super excited about what I'm going to be able to bring back from this conference to help train our next generation of scientists to be much more effective than we've been, or than I've been stumbling in the dark.
Thank you. My name is Gil Nelson. I am the lead PI on Integrated Digitized Biocollections, IDIG-Bio, which is an NSF project under the Advancing Digitization of Biodiversity Collections program. I'm also the full-time project director, more than full-time project director. And you guys have all been so succinct, it leaves me a lot of time. So get ready. So we are a project that includes, at this point, projects in every state and one or two territories. We currently have a database of biodiversity specimen data that totals about 121 million records. Those are transcribed text records, and those 121 million records really represents to us 300 or 400 million records, because some of those are like hundreds of fish in a jar or many butterflies in a tray or whatever that might be databased together. We've been working very, very hard with that. We also have a database of about 30-something million media records, which are images, videos, CT scans, et cetera, of those specimens, which we are also pushing very hard on. And I think my real interest in AccelNet comes from the fact that we have a very close working relationship with the Global Biodiversity Informatics Facility, which is a global, international, about 120 or 100 countries, I forget exactly the number now. They have slightly more specimen data records than we do, although a lot of those are probably the ones that we also have. And they also take observational data, which by cooperative agreement with NSF we do not do. We were strictly museum collections oriented. And and we worked very closely with the Australian Atlas of Living Australia and the folks in Canberra. We've been there several times and they've come to see us and visit with us. We work very closely with the new DISCO, which is the new project in Europe that contains about 121 nations and many collections that they are building something similar to IDIG-Bio. We work with China, Kaping Ma in China, and NSII has been very cooperative with us. And we are currently meeting informally, regularly, to make sure that we're not all on separate paths. But as anything, when you're working together out of goodwill, goodwill doesn't always pay the bills, and goodwill doesn't always keep you focused. And so we would like to be involved in AccelNet so that we can be focused. We can have a reason to be focused. We are just about to put on board through IDIG-Bio, through an NSF supplement, a global communications coordinator whose job it will be to keep us connected and keep us all moving in the same direction, because all of these things are developing at the same time, and we know that in the end, all data is probably going to migrate to one place. We're going to be using similar ingestion strategies, the same standards, all of that. And we don't need to be going this direction while we're building. We need to be going this direction while we're building so we can support that. And so that's IDIC Bio's goal over the next several years. Although Claire will probably say, yeah, but your funding is up in 2 years. We don't intend for that to happen. We think we'll be going on at least another 5 or 6 years, because the NSF is going to fund new TCNs, new projects within our bailiwick, and it's folks that we'll need to provide service to. So we're hoping to move on with that regard. But in any event, we think worldwide, these are the largest networks in biodiversity data in the world, and we need to be working even more closely together. Right now we meet kind of ad hoc when we happen to all be at the same conference at the same time. We meet online, but our plan is to have much more intensive meeting between developers and folks who can actually make this happen. So that's where we are. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Leslie Reese. I'm an assistant professor at Georgetown University, and I participate in and lead several networks that I'll be talking about later today. And I was also a research scientist here at SESYNC, where I started some of these networks. And so it's great for me to be back, and I'm also excited to hear more about AccelNet.
Hi, I'm Jessica Vitek. I am an associate professor at the University of Maryland, and I'm also here today to share some of my experiences in creating and growing different types of centers, labs, and national and international networks. So you'll be hearing from me later.
I'm Kyla Trekkie. I come from George Washington University, just down the street. I'm associate professor in the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. I spend a lot of my time working on team science issues. My own research is specifically dedicated to motivation in teams and trying to understand what motivates people or demotivates them to work collaboratively. I also work in communication and transdisciplinary teams. I'll be speaking later today a little bit about looking at the sort of life cycle of what it means to be a scientist in a teaming environment. I'm also the University Associate Dean for Innovative and Collaborative Pedagogy and the present president of the International Network for the Science of Team Science, which I hope you all join. And if you're interested in our conferences, we could talk at a coffee break as well, because we have a conference coming up at Duke. So it was nice to meet everyone, and I look forward to our discussion.
Hello, everyone. My name is Roberto Delgado. I'm a program director in the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. I'm involved in a number of Arctic observing networks, both domestically through the U.S. Federal Interagency and also internationally across the circumpolar Arctic. I'm paired this afternoon with Guy in the session Defining a Collective Mission and Vision, and I'll be presenting a bit of a case study, hopefully sharing some best practices and lessons learned.
I'm Cindy Parr. I'm kind of an ambassador to USDA. I know most of you in the room here are in the NSF world, and I came from that world primarily in biodiversity, so a lot of the stuff that Gil talked about I worked on as a leader in the Encyclopedia of Life project when I was at the Smithsonian Institution. But for the past 5 years, I've been at USDA, where I'm working primarily on open data and big data, strategic planning, policy, and infrastructure, and I am a PI on 2 USDA-funded projects right now. One is a series of best practices for data management workshops, and the other is just beginning, and that has to do with data harmonization for crop modeling internationally. So you'll hear more about that from me later this afternoon.
I'm Owen White. I'm at the University of Maryland. I'm Assistant Director of the Institute for Genome Sciences. I've been primarily involved in the National Institutes of Health research space. I've been involved with many large data generation projects having to do with looking at microbiome as well as human data. We are deeply involved with team science for management of harmonization of metadata associated with patient phenotypes and lots of important health topics in that area. And I'd say that one of the things that I think is bringing us a lot together is that the data generation that's now going on in the sequencing space is so huge that it's really requires that lots of interdisciplinary teams get together at the level of doing bioinformatics, which is my original background, as well as collecting samples from patients and lots of things like that.
Good morning, everybody. I'm John Kramer. I'm the Director for Interdisciplinary Science here at SESYNC. My work here in a broad sense is focused on the design and implementation of programs and then ultimately evaluation of not just those individual programs, but this complex space and organization that we've stood up over the last 8 years. In a little more specific sense, I'm very interested in working on the practical aspects of team science, how to help interdisciplinary teams function in a very day-to-day manner, and that can extend everything from planning and design of their projects all the way to facilitation and help with resolving conflicts and developing opportunities. It's nice to have you all here and look forward to meeting you over the course of the next day and a half.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Balanson. I also work here at SESYNC. I'm the Research Program Manager, so I work with Carrie and John supporting our synthesis teams that come through the center, and I'm excited to be in the workshop and help support everything.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. We've got a great diverse group here. I look forward to the discussions during the coffee breaks and lunch. I think we'll have some really interesting discussion. We do have a few minutes before our first break, so I'd like to invite Margaret Palmer, Dr. Margaret Palmer, to come back and take any questions you might have had after her presentation.
It is called team metacognition. I will tell you, I'll warn you that it is theory. Okay. And one of the things we found when we were designing SESYNC and beginning is that, and Guy might have a tick when I say this, but is that a lot of the work on team science was very theoretical, and that trying to take that from the theory to the practice was not easy. But we did start with a lot of that literature, also the literature from organizational science and other fields, and try and say, okay, this is the theory. How could we possibly, put something in practice that would be directed at that? So
just as a follow-on comment, would it be possible to it's just occurring to me, would it be possible, or if you think it would be useful, to have a place where we could post resources that we think the group might be interested in sharing, or maybe we're planning on doing that?
I think absolutely we can do that. We do have, a collection of sort of good papers to read on team science and other resources, as well as other issues. So sure, we can do that. And at some point before the conference is over, we can let you know where that is.
I think that throughout your presentation, you mentioned that you use SESYNC as a case study. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate on, say, like the genesis of your center, how it evolved into what it is today, pitfalls that you had to avoid and problems that you have to overcome as, maybe best practices and lessons to be, shared with us to avoid those pitfalls? And
well, that's a big question, and I'm probably going to ask John to come up here as well, if you would, John, because he's going, oh, really? There's a lot we could cover. So I'll start with talking about the genesis. And if you're not familiar with this, NSF has had a number of synthesis centers. And the idea behind a synthesis center, and they've mostly come out of the Biodirectorate, is that there's a lot of data and information out there. And so rather than starting every project by collecting new original data, what kinds of questions can we address using existing data, theories, and models? And so NSF put out a call for an environmental synthesis center, but our view, both myself, John, and other members of the leadership, in part because of our own research, we're aware that environmental problems are social problems, and that oftentimes the social dynamics are the reason that the environmental problems persist. So we proposed a socio-environmental synthesis center. Now, the idea behind synthesis centers is that they are team-focused. And so the funding we have is to support teams of people from around the world. They submit proposals to us to address questions in which they can use existing data, theories, and models. Now, Having said that, there's an awful lot that's involved, and I'm going to try to just hit on some of the things I think are relevant to this network of networks. One is it takes resources. A good network, a good facilitated teams, and helping those teams is not something that just happens easily. In our case, because it's a synthesis center, we have a large computational team that actually provides significant help to our individual teams. What's relevant to you? Don't assume all the members of your network will be able to write code, will understand how to access data portals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing I think that's relevant is we are a service organization. If you're the leader of a network, you've got to be someone who is willing to provide a service. It's a lot of work, and oftentimes in my case, my own research didn't benefit directly from running the center. Help me think of things to weigh in on, John.
I think another piece to think about, as you asked about the history of the center and how we evolved, and I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow afternoon, but at the core in the early days, it was a commitment of those in the leadership of the center to challenge ourselves and learn continuously. And I would say that's not generally an easy process. We all think we know how to do things, and I think what we learned, because we were doing something that was very new, is that we didn't know all the time how to do things, and we had to figure out on the fly. And someone mentioned startups. We were very much a startup culture when the doors opened. Margaret mentioned people, and I think the other piece of this puzzle that was so powerful was commitment by the people here to be invested in the center and its development over time. And then finally, the processes that Margaret showed on the slide a little while ago were the result of lots of hard work in attempting to do things really directed around how do we best serve the community that we wanted to benefit from our work here, and how do we build their capacity. And over time, what we developed is a theory of change on what we wanted to do. We felt very strongly that this had to be not separate efforts, but really well-coordinated efforts. Learning how to do that is really, I think, part of the thing perhaps we're both most proud of over the course of the 8 years that we've been in existence.
Yeah, and I would just add to that to understand that we're just an example. The issues you have and the challenges will be different. So the reason we needed all those processes and structures and approaches and a highly iterative leadership approach is because we were trying to bring together some of the most interdisciplinary teams out there. So we're talking a team that includes a climate scientist, a psychologist, an economist. And so our mission was not just the production of great research. That was one of them. But it was to build capacity to do interdisciplinary science and build new communities. Now, one of your goals is to build new communities. Capacity to do interdisciplinary work may or may not be core part of what your centers are. So I don't want you to think our center is a perfect example. Each topic you have is going to have some unique issues. But I think what John said is pretty accurate, willingness to experiment, try, and move forward. And I just can't emphasize enough the role of the leaders in direct contact. If the leader becomes sort of a titular head and is not in direct contact with key people in the network or people in the network, it just won't work. People want to talk to the person at the top, and they want them to be engaged. If there's other specific things, there's a lot we could cover. We actually have a paper we have written on the process of facilitating interdisciplinary, which we will put online for others to read. I also say questions for me are great, but also you may want to ask questions of one another, because we have some really interesting people in the audience here. Yes, Cindy.
Actually, I'll toss this question out for everyone. You've
Great.
mentioned concepts like lean startups, or actually you didn't use the word lean startup, but I know that that's what I recognized in some of your slides, and that's from the business world. And then theories of change and organizational theory. These are all things that are broader than the science community. So what can any of you share about how you think the scientific community is just like these other kinds of communities, and how much are there different? How much do we have to adapt those theories for the scientific enterprise?
I'll start with one thing, which is you may have to be willing to push back on your program officers. So, for example, we used a developmental evaluation approach for the first 5 years, which means we did not set out to do a controlled study on what worked and what didn't. We didn't have control groups. We did work, as you say, in the lean fashion as a startup where we would try stuff, and we had close communication among the leadership. We watched our teams, we watched the networks, we sat in on part of what they were doing, we talked to them, and then we would have discussions, and it would be, I'm not sure that's working, let's try this. And site review teams don't really like that. Well, where is your formal evaluation? What are your metrics? Now, we did the bean counting that we all need to do, number of papers published, number of people from different disciplines, et cetera. But the hard part, and John's going to talk a little bit about this today, it's really hard. How do you measure things like increased capacity to work in interdisciplinary teams? That is really hard to do, and we were trying to accelerate that, not necessarily do a study on it the way a scientist of team science might do. So
maybe other people shared this perspective, is that let's call it disciplinary scientists are very often very bogged down into the minutiae of their own discipline. Ones that we start reaching out into, in my own personal case, education first, to make those researchers aware that there's so much scholarship on education as there is on chemistry, biology, you name it. It's already, a pretty high activation energy. I'm a chemist, so I have to. And
to use chemistry.
Yeah, and speaking of that, even the language, it's important. When I talk to other chemists or physicists about this education opportunity, which will require an IRB, they have to start from scratch. So going back to the startup culture, that risk aversion, it's an important hurdle that we have to get past. And I'm sure that with this, network initiative, network of networks, team science, it's very likely going to be like the same thing. You have to get them up to speed and on board, and that's a challenge in itself.
So your comment about learning what science of education is about, that's an example of making sure everybody understands what different individuals bring to the team. And it's also an example of sort of eliciting tacit knowledge with respect to language. People will use words, and it's important to have an atmosphere where individuals are comfortable saying, what does that mean? Or that's not what I think that means. Stephen, you had a comment?
Yeah, just...
Wait just a minute for the microphone, if you would. I know we're getting Carrie running around. But
That's my exercise for the day.
So just the notion of what's the difference between sort of a commercial lean startup and something like this kind of enterprise. I've experienced in both worlds. My life is probably going to be much shorter because of it. But aside from the fact that you think as hard as you can possibly work to get these things going, and it takes like 10 times that, that's pretty similar between the two. The difference, I think, is there are opportunities in this kind of environment to be much more adaptive, and I think this came out in the previous discussion about how SESYNC formed itself and had to sort of rethink a lot of things as they went along. That being open to be adaptive is absolutely critical, because there's so many ideas that are littering the highway of these kinds of projects that you just need to be able to be, okay, let's take a deep breath and think about this, and what do we have to do? Let's call our program officer and say, this just isn't working. This is what we're thinking. What do you think we should be doing now? And just be able to be open to adapting to something new and rethinking something, maybe even from the ground up.
Other comments, Claire, and then Leslie?
I just want to reiterate one point of that adaptation, because much of AccelNet is all about linking
U.S. and international networks. And when you work in that international realm, the context is often changing very rapidly, and so that ability to adapt is absolutely critical.
And I'll also say, and then we'll pass to Leslie, please, back in the back. She had her hand up. With respect to the difference between business and the kind of thing we're doing, the other thing that the science of team science has emphasized is that usually when we think of teams, we think of things like, groups in the Army, groups in the military, where there are clearly defined roles for individuals in that team. That's not at all the case. Not only is that not the case, our mission isn't as clearly defined as it is, and even so, let's say a surgical team in an operating room. We don't know where we're going because what we're doing is about discovery. So that's why this adaptation really is important, and we are very different from most other teams. Leslie?
I was actually in the business world for 10 years before coming to academia, and one of the things, first of all, and I've brought a lot of those skills, and one of the things I've noticed that's really different about academia is, first of all, there can sometimes be a certain disdain for the kind of attitudes you get from the real world, the business world, where you have to think about the return on investment, or you have to realize that if you're trying to build something, it's one thing to try to do a research project, you can do it and publish it, but if you're trying to build a network, there has to be a market for that network. There have to be people out there who are interested in what you're doing, and this is probably one of the hardest things, the customer is always right. You know, even if you disagree with them, they always have the option to walk away. And then the last thing I'll say is I feel like there's always this resistance to how important leadership and management is. You know, in my field, there's a real tendency for people when they're putting in NSF grants to not put in summer salary for themselves. Oh, we should be giving that to the graduate students. No, you need to build in and honor the fact that this is going to take your time and that it's a really important part of the project. No business would start a business giving zero money to the manager.
Or one comment just about working within the research community. I think, and it was mentioned here by Claire, or brought up, you're dealing with culture. And so if you're working across disciplines, a network, it requires individuals to trust one another. And if you're siloed in your discipline and you're not really understanding what your partners or other pieces of the network, perhaps it's the content or perhaps it's the methodologies or things like that, how do you get beyond that barrier to develop the sort of level of trust that's needed to create a cohesive network? And I think that's one. I think the other thing is just human nature. Science is grounded in argumentation and in critical review. And again, when you go back to some of the things, a network needs to be able to interact socially. And so people need to be able to interact socially. And that's when emotions come in and feelings can get hurt if you're arguing at the wrong moment and time. And so I think that trying to understand what's the right mode of operation for whichever environment you're in at that point in time. Are you interacting socially, and how do you, because that can also help you to build trust. So I think that those are a couple key issues to work or to try to resolve within any network, is the cultural differences, and it could be international cultural differences, it could be cultural differences across disciplines, and then it's what domain are you interacting in at any point in time, and when's the right time to argue, and when's the right time to just have a coffee or a good glass of wine.
And if anyone has examples of how to facilitate social interactions when you mostly interact remotely, it would be great to hear your experiences, because it is true, there's a lot of work showing that social interactions lead to trust.
In listening to the comments, it draws my attention to a couple themes. I think, Eduardo, how you mentioned when you're seeking support, how do you write into your plans these sort of needed aspects of the project, which have to do with process, have to do with teaming, and don't have so much to do directly with the scientific problem that you're dealing with. And I think our culture of science is changing, and I think it's changing rather rapidly, where process is becoming more important to even reviewers. I think there's some reviewers that don't even want to look at that, but the job of any scientist is to bring the appropriate science to the person or people that are decision makers in how that science is going to be supported. And it reminds me of, as a mixed methods sort of person, where you go on and on and on about how you're going to do your quantitative analysis, and then you say something like in 2 sentences, and then we're going to use qualitative methods to analyze the interviews. It's sort of, there's an entire, it's sort of like saying, and we're going to do all this by using team science principles. There's a science to it, and I think as scientists, it's part of our job, no matter what your discipline or sector is, to bring that science to the people that are, and that's hard, but it's just as hard as if you're working on a complex problem and you need a biochemist and you know nothing about biochemistry. It's the same effort. I think also, too, it's important to understand, especially in, it doesn't matter if you're in health, biomed, if you're in sustainability, the teams are also going through a culture change where more and more we ask the question, why aren't the people who have the problem part of the scientific team? Why is it only those people from the academy that get to be on the scientific team? And I think this is something that is really sort of a challenge to those of us that are in the academy, because, when you write a grant, or if you're putting together a team just to do a project and you include, say, for instance, a parent of a child with autism, the team often says, well, what does this person know about research design? I said, they know more than anyone knows about the problem, and that is about research design. So I think over time, the academy, and I think there's a number of people here that sort of live on this bridge, the academy needs to understand how to work with career professionals. And when I use the term professionals, people who have experiential knowledge and or skills that contribute to the scientific program, that we have to, and we have a responsibility to describe is critical to the outcomes we're expecting of doing the science. We can't do a team science project without those people involved that are skilled in process or skilled in whatever needs that you need, skilled in helping manage networks, etc. Or we can't possibly talk about the needs of children's health care without at least parents who have children who need, it affects the agenda of the science. And back to your point, it's the responsibility of the scientist to make the case as to why this is important to the success of the scientific enterprise.
Just coming from industry again and the business side, one thing that we have, I would like to ask also, what, in terms of SESYNC, what has been the role of industry? We have been taking advantage of the transition to practice initiatives at NSF, for example, to make practical many of the research, work done at universities. And one of the things we see is that, very few researchers actually are interested on the TTP option on a grant, because it involves actual deployment, actual implementation, actual, practical, application of the research. But at the same time, we found that, for example, I also a NSF Innovation Corp mentor. So we found that if they get the training in those, for example, the NSF iCorp initiative, they actually are very, very effective. The thing is that they never had that training. Once they are exposed to that, then they understand how important it is to see the application of the research in real life or real implementations. And we would like to help that process. And that's what actually I'm trying to do, right? And we are also not mentioning, for example, national labs. So one of the things that we do is also bringing national labs into the equation. So we have academia, we have government, and we have industry. And it's not just startups. It might be companies, well-established companies, but they already have the networks, they already have the connection, they already have the needs, actually, in many cases. We just need to make that integration, but that bridge between the two, right?
Which is why that program's so great, the I-Corps, yeah.
Exactly. So I just wanted to make that emphasis on that and maybe ask, what has been the role of industry on SESYNC, or what could be that role?
We have so many interesting people ready to speak, so we can talk at the break about that. Steve?
I just want to get back to Cindy's question about the organizational literature, something I know well, and point out, because of the conversation, that any form of organizing is a set of trade-offs. That's just what we're talking about, is a set of trade-offs. And the hard thing is, what are we trading off? So the startup culture, so you're trading off risk versus reward. The funding cycle, quarterly versus 3 to 5 years with the one-year non-cost extension. We have a high temporary labor force in academia. Several of you have announced that you've moved from place to place and are doing things. So we're actually much better than the current non-science workforce in managing turnover in workforce. So we've been giggers for a lot longer than the gig economy has been around. We're talking a little bit about the way that networks work, and so you may move from place to place, but you don't leave your network, right? And most young professors know that the network is more important than the job at the moment, because the network will sustain you and the job will not. And so we actually have a lot of this. What's interesting is that most people enter that literature, or enter that experience of being in an organization with a lot less skill than you would expect, right? And now I guess the question I'm asking you is, it's a trade-off. It's a cost to manage a team. It's a cost to run a network. You talked about this. And so the question that I would keep on asking is, does the cost of being a team scientist, running your team like a team science project, is it better than just half-assing it that we've been doing for so long? Because it may be that half-assing it, technical term, is actually a not bad approach for small teams, but it probably isn't a good approach for 80-person teams. And so I think that a lot of what I was hoping to get out of this is the trade-offs of when do you make a decision about the kind of organizing.
Yeah, the only comment I'd add to that is one of the most common mistakes we see in scientific teams is, and it's actually more common in my area, in sort of the biophysical sciences, is the PI taking charge. This is what we're going to do. And that really, leadership is about, as John says, which I love this comment he made at one point, if he's facilitated a room, if he's been a leader, when he walks out at the end of the day and they're all talking to each other and don't even notice him, it's been good leadership. And I think that's a great quote. Go ahead, Gil.
You talked about, this is not a military type operation where you have very defined roles, very defined organizational missions and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's absolutely the case. And I think it's very, very important in network of networks and in running a network that you understand when you bring personnel in, you're not, because you're a biologist, you don't go look for a biologist. You look for somebody who can do the job that you want them to do. And in IDIC Bio's experience, we value very highly autonomy. So we try to hire smart people with a lot of go get them. And one of the questions I like to ask is, how do you feel about not having direct supervision? How do you feel about having to decide what you're going to do and make some of those decisions? And if they say, well, I really like to have a supervisor, then I probably don't want to hire them. I would rather have somebody. And one of the things that our previous director used to say regularly, and I think it's absolutely true, is that there is so much to do that if you find something you really like within our group, probably nobody else is working on it. It's valuable, and you should move that direction and do it, because there's more to do than we have time to do to begin with. So if you're good at something and you're moving our organization forward, we will value that. So that autonomous behavior, I think, in this realm is very, very important. And then the second thing that we really strive for is cross-functionality. We don't want people that can do one thing, and I don't want to feel like that I have to go to Steve to find out if Claire can do this for me because she works for Steve. We finally redid our organizational chart not long ago, and now we have a Venn diagram. We don't have lines and boxes. We're all in concentric circles, and we decide you're in this circle, but you're kind of overlapping that circle. So if they need your help, give it to them, and don't go to this person up here to get permission. Just do it, because the work has to get done. So I think cross-functionality of people and autonomous behavior for us has been extremely important, even though it can be a little bit nerve-wracking from time to time if somebody gets a little too autonomous. But by and large, we think that's very important.
Very good. Who else?
Hello, everybody. I was just texting one of my friends that this conversation is amazing. So 2 quick points I'd like to make. One, coming back to Margaret's earlier request that we comment on what we've seen work for collaborations remote. So the person I was just texting, I was just on a call with this morning. It's a remote consortium of people all around the world. And what I've seen that works really well for that consortium and for others that I'm a part of is a couple of things. Having meetings that occur regularly, but not at a rhythm that's too burdensome because everyone's busy. So like once a week, once every second week, once every 3 weeks, depending on the needs. So it's predictable. People build it into their calendars. I find that very effective. Where bandwidth permits, I find using video incredibly important. It's
Yes,
such a
it
tiny
is.
thing, but just being able to see facial expression, to be able to figure out, when you want to contribute, people's faces change when they're about to talk. Having that kind of nonverbal feedback, I find really valuable. And then, for each of those meetings, you want to make sure you're not just meeting for the sake of having a meeting. You want to have something you want to achieve. And then the outcome of that meeting needs to set up what you want to achieve for the next meeting, and agendas need to be shared. So people know they can prepare, they know what they're in for. And I also would, my preference is to keep them short and sweet. I find, if you force people to do everything within 30 minutes, you'd be surprised at how concise people can get. I was not concise just now, but those are some things that I've seen work in the different projects that I've been on. And then I also wanted to make a quick second point. What I've seen very effective and pitfalls I've seen engaging with the private sector. So I've been in academia, I've been in government, I've been in the NGO space, I briefly dabbled in the private sector. Of those 4 categories, so what I think I understand is the pressure on people's time in the private sector, how they have to account for every 15 minutes, how they spend, who they charge to for those 15-minute increments. That limits how much they can engage. So I've been at workshops where, we want to invite people from across all 4 of those categories. The private sector folks show up for 1 day of the 4, or like half a day. Or if you want people to join meetings every week, they'll show up for like 30 minutes the first call, and then you never see them again. That's fine, because if what we can do in these other sectors, if we can have a clear, someone said the phrase value proposition. I love that phrase. If you can go to them with a clear value proposition, understand what they need, say, okay, great, now we know what you need, we'll get back to you when we figured it out, instead of expecting them to engage more routinely the way folks from other sectors are more free to do. I feel like having those constraints that folks in the private sector face clearly in mind when planning how to engage with them, I find very helpful as well.
I think that's incredibly important, and we've even tried when we can to compensate people for their time, which if you have the
Thanks for that.
resources, that's great.
From Nancy Grimm, that we in the Urban Resilience Network and the NSF-funded network do almost all of our interacting on Zoom, but the in-person annual all-hands meetings are hugely important for cementing social connections. So just a voice from the live stream.
Yeah, in person, and then also when you do have these calls, video is critical, because we all know if we're just on the phone, you start double tasking, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, super fascinating conversation. So one of the things that was interesting for me taking over a global research project sort of midstream as a sort of older kind of science, I would say, under IGBP, was the International Geosphere Biosphere Program was transferring into this newer kind of science under Future Earth. And I think what was really interesting was some of the things that you've discussed in the beginning, Margaret, about leadership were really interesting, because the science, the scientific steering committee at that point was charged for, sort of devising a science plan, directing it, and sort of then sending out the troops to create the science. And so, we were very clear, I think, within the scientific steering committee when I came on board, that that was not going to be the model for the Global Land Program moving forward, and that it was going to be a much more lateral organization with sort of seeking to kind of create that kind of effervescence, that activation throughout the network, knowing that it's such a big field and we need to activate it all at once, and we don't have a lot of resources. And so how to kind of create something where everyone is kind of carrying a part of this moving, raft. or, but the challenge has been, and I think also partly why I'm here and so compelled to build, to kind of stretch out into other networks through the AccelNet program, is that we don't have the cyber infrastructure and sort of the even sort of soft infrastructure in place. We're still kind of learning by doing. How do you lateralize a network, and then how do you create the communication channels beyond Zoom and webinars, and to really kind of create these new structures is a challenge for us. And I think also, we are behind in the U.S. in terms of the international funding for science through our traditional channels. In principle, I feel like we're starting to get that this TD approach, transdisciplinary approaches, or what we call interdisciplinary approaches here in the U.S. are so fundamental, but I don't sense that our programs are quite there yet in understanding the need for that kind of infrastructure and the fact that we have to pay for it. There's only so much you can build on people's backs for free.
And I will comment on the first part of what you said, where the leadership decides what has to be done and then distributes it. And that reminds me of the phrase, the loading dock model, which is like you have a dump truck, you bring it up, you dump it. And that is the phrase that's often used for traditional communication by scientists. We're going to do the work, discover things, and then we'll do outreach and we'll deliver it. And then things will change, and it doesn't work that way. So, other comments? Let's move back here to Cindy, and then we'll come back to you.
Great discussion, and I want to put in my 2 cents from my perspective to my own questions. So it's sort of been touched on before, but I think one of the differences between the scientific enterprise and business in particular is the amount of autonomy that scientists are given and expected to have, which is great because of being able to surface innovative new ideas, but can also be a hindrance when you're trying to build a large network and you've got a lot of people who've been rewarded for their entire careers to toot their own horn and toot their own ideas and not necessarily do so in a team context. So, and then in the business world, where it's a very top-down decision-making chain where basically the boss decides the direction and then everybody has to fall in line, and they of course suffer from problems of, well, how do you bring the message up that maybe that is not a good direction? How do the people who are actually in the trenches doing the work be heard as to what they think could work better or could, so business cultures are struggling with the opposite kind of problem. Now, as a federal employee in an agency that does science, the Agricultural Research Service sort of has elements of both of these cultures. So we're accountable to taxpayers. We get relatively large amounts of money that gets spread very thinly across all the scientists. So it's not like it's well funded, but it's basically to accomplish particular initiatives or objectives. And then we struggle because our scientists are just like your scientists. They've been rewarded for autonomy, but they have to work within this sort of top-down structure. So that's the tension that we're dealing with, and that's why I'm here, because we're doing our best to sort of make the best of both of these worlds. And the last thing I want to say is you asked about techniques for bringing the social aspect to these distributed communications. So I work on agile software development, and our teams of developers are all around the world. And the particular agreement we have right now is with, they're a for-profit company, but they do government nonprofit kind of work. And they start every half-hour scrum with everybody talking about their balance. And so you basically give yourself a score of where you are on a scale of 1 to 10, how you're feeling today, and usually people toss in a little explanation about why. I'm really stressed out because I've got lots of deadlines, or I just took a vacation and so my balance is high, or it's Friday, I'm really happy because it's the weekend, or I really made a lot of progress on my work, so my scores, usually the scores are between 6 and 8. Very rarely do we get as high as 9. Very rarely do we get below a 5, but if somebody gives you a 5, you know that you need to approach them carefully because they're on the edge.
Watch out.
But it definitely has helped along with the visual
Okay, last comment goes to Eduardo, then we need to break.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Just like Cindy did, I would like circle back to my original comment and thank you all for the discussion, particularly Timothy and also you, Margaret, because it seems, at least to me, that communication it's at least one of the common themes that has to be resolved for a network of networks to become effective, not only in terms of, say, relationship between the private sector and academia. I've had that problem where the private sector being driven by deadlines and profits would ask you for the results of some analysis yesterday, and you have other things to do, like, I don't know, teaching or a report. Also internationally, the culture being different. Here in the US, you may produce results, but if it's August and a collaborator in France needs to do something, it's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for the next month, So at least to me, knowing how to navigate all those communication-related issues seems to be one of the main issues that have to be resolved. And obviously, several people also mentioned resources. Maybe that's where NSF comes in.
Great. I think that those are really important points, and emphasize that it's very time-consuming. So go ahead and assume that's going to be the case. So with that, we'll take a break.